Every noble house in the eastern provinces sent flowers to Thornmere Castle that autumn. White lilies. Funeral arrangements disguised as well-wishes, packed into lacquered boxes and delivered by riders who lingered too long at the gates, straining for a glimpse of the Duke's silhouette in the windows above. They wanted confirmation. They wanted to see the shadow of a man bent in half by whatever unnamed sickness had been devouring him from the inside out for 3 years. What they got instead was silence. The gates stayed shut. The flowers were burned in the courtyard without being opened. And Duke Lucien Ravencroft, the man half the kingdom had already buried in whispered conversations over brandy, stood at the highest window of his keep and watched the smoke rise. He was not dead. He was counting. Sooner or later, every single one of them would come close enough to touch. The carriage pitched sideways as the road dissolved into mud and broken stone. Eveline Hartwell pressed her palm flat against the window frame to steady herself and watched the landscape change from rolling farmland into something starved. The trees here grew crooked. Their bark had split in vertical seams as though the wood beneath had swollen and cracked, and the branches hung low enough to scrape the roof of the carriage with a sound like fingernails dragging across leather. No birds. She noticed that first. For the last 6 miles there had been no birdsong at all. The driver had not spoken since they crossed the river at Ashford. He was a Thornmere man, sent by the castle. Gray-haired, thick-shouldered, with hands so scarred across the knuckles they looked like they had been stitched together from separate pieces of skin. When Eveline had tried to make conversation at the start of the journey, he had looked at her the way a butcher looks at livestock that does not yet understand where it is going. She stopped trying after that. The letter sat in her coat pocket, folded so many times the creases had worn through to holes. She did not need to read it again. She had memorized every word the night Lord Aldrich Voss handed it to her across his desk, his expression arranged into the careful mask of a man delivering someone else's death sentence while pretending it was an invitation. The Duke requires a new physician's liaison, Aldrich had said, pouring wine he did not offer her. Someone educated, someone discreet. His household has made the request through official channels, and I have recommended you. You recommended me. Eveline had kept her voice flat, controlled, a skill she had perfected during the 2 years she spent believing Aldrich Voss would marry her. To serve a dying man in a castle no one returns from. You are dramatic. 3 liaisons before me. 2 resigned within a month. 1 disappeared entirely. Aldrich set down his glass. His fingers were long, elegant, manicured weekly by a woman he paid to come to his private chambers every Thursday. Eveline used to find those hands beautiful. Now she saw them for what they were. Tools designed to hold things without leaving marks. Lucien Ravencroft is sick, Aldrich said. Genuinely, profoundly sick. The silver scarring alone has spread across most of his torso. His physicians estimate months, not years. What I'm offering you is a position of proximity to one of the wealthiest estates in the kingdom during the final phase of its lord's life. When the Duke dies, and he will die, whoever is standing closest to the machinery of that household will have access to information that is worth more than anything I could put in a marriage contract. He paused. Let the silence do what silence always did in rooms where one person held all the power. This is not exile, Eveline. This is an investment in both of us. She had wanted to throw the wine in his face. She had wanted to ask him how long he had been planning to trade her like currency, whether the decision came before or after he stopped visiting her bed, whether the promises he made in the dark had ever been anything more than vocabulary exercises for a man who practiced manipulation the way other men practiced fencing. Instead, she took the letter, folded it, put it in her pocket. Because Eveline Hartwell understood something about survival that Aldrich Voss, for all his cleverness, had never learned. You do not fight the current when you are drowning. You let it carry you until your feet touch something solid. Then you decide who to pull under with you. The carriage lurched to a stop. Through the window, Thornmere Castle materialized out of the gray air like something the landscape had been trying to hide. It was enormous. Not the way palaces are enormous, with gilded facades and symmetrical gardens designed to make visitors feel small. Thornmere was enormous the way geological formations are enormous. It looked like it had grown out of the rock rather than been built on top of it, all dark stone and angular towers and walls so thick they seemed to absorb sound. The windows were narrow, defensive. set deep into the stone like eyes squinting against a wind that never stopped. The driver opened her door without a word. Cold air hit her face so hard her eyes watered. She climbed down, her boots sinking into mud that smelled of iron and wet stone, and she stood there with her single trunk and her ruined coat and the letter in her pocket, staring up at a castle that looked less like a home than a warning. The main doors opened. A woman emerged. Mid-50s, rail-thin, dressed in black wool buttoned to her throat. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin at her temples, and she moved with the precise mechanical efficiency of someone who had long ago eliminated every unnecessary gesture from her daily life. "Miss Hartwell?" "Yes, I am Mrs. Blackwood. I manage the household." She did not extend her hand. Her eyes moved over Eveline the way a jeweler examines a stone, not for beauty, but for structural flaws. "You are younger than I expected." "I am older than I look." "That remains to be seen." Mrs. Blackwood turned. "Bring your trunk. The staff will not carry it for you. We are short-handed and have been for some time." Eveline dragged her trunk up the front steps herself. The stone was slick with moisture that never fully dried, and the entrance hall beyond the doors was so cold she could see her breath hanging in the air. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above iron chandeliers that held half their original candles, and the walls were lined with portraits of Ravencroft ancestors, whose painted eyes followed her with expressions that ranged from contempt to mild curiosity about how long she would last. "The Duke's wing is the North Tower," Mrs. Blackwood said without slowing. Her heels struck the floor in a rhythm so consistent it sounded mechanical. "You will not enter it without being summoned. The physician's study is on the second floor, East Corridor. Dr. Erasmus Vane is the senior physician. He has been treating the Duke for 2 years. You will coordinate with him and report to him. Your quarters are on the third floor, west side. They are adequate. Do not expect luxury." "I was not expecting luxury." "Good. Then you will not be disappointed, which is more than I can say for your predecessors." Mrs. Blackwood stopped at the foot of a staircase so wide 3 men could have climbed it abreast. She turned. For the first time, something shifted behind her eyes. Not warmth, something closer to a calculation being completed. "The Duke is not what the letters describe, Miss Hartwell. I want you to understand that before you meet him. Whatever Lord Voss told you, whatever the court physicians wrote in their reports, whatever rumors you heard on the road, none of it is accurate. Thornmere is not what it appears to be. Nothing here is." "Is that a warning?" "It is a fact. What you do with it is your concern." Mrs. Blackwood resumed walking. "Supper is at 7. The Duke does not attend. You eat with the household staff in the lower hall. Do not wander the castle after dark. The corridors are not well lit and the floors are uneven. We lost a maid to a broken neck on the east staircase last winter." "She fell?" Mrs. Blackwood did not answer. Eveline's room was exactly what the word adequate was invented to describe. A narrow bed with a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and something faintly chemical. A desk. A chair. A window that looked north toward the Duke's tower, which rose above the rest of the castle like a finger pointed at a sky that never seemed to clear. The glass was old, warped slightly, so the tower appeared to bend and straighten depending on where she stood. She unpacked her trunk. 3 dresses, 2 of them mended so many times, the original fabric was more memory than material. Medical texts. Correspondence files. A small leather journal she had been keeping since her first year at the Ashford Medical Collegium, filled with notes and handwriting that had evolved from careful and optimistic to compressed and sharp, like the words themselves had learned to take up less space. She sat on the bed. The mattress was thin enough that she felt the wooden slats beneath, and the springs protested with a sound like small animals in distress. Aldrich had sent her here to watch a man die, to stand close enough to the corpse to catalog what was left behind, to send information back through channels she was not supposed to know existed, about estates and accounts and political alliances that would fracture the moment the Duke stopped breathing. She understood this. She was not naive. She had stopped being naive the night Aldrich told her, with the same calm voice he used to order dinner, that marriage was no longer advantageous for his political position, but that he valued her enough to offer her this alternative. Valued her. Like a horse that could still pull a cart after it was too old to race. She stood up, walked to the window, pressed her forehead against the cold glass and stared at the Duke's tower until the warped glass made it swim. She was here. That was the only fact that mattered right now. Everything else was negotiable. The summons came at 9 the following morning. A boy, no older than 12, appeared at her door with dirt under his fingernails, and an expression that suggested he had been running. "Duke wants you," was all he said, and then he turned and walked so fast she nearly lost him twice in the labyrinth of corridors that connected the west wing to the north tower. The tower staircase was a spiral, tight and steep, and the stone walls were damp enough to leave moisture on her fingertips when she steadied herself. The air changed as she climbed, warmer, but with a metallic undertone, like the smell of blood thinned with water. At the top, a single door. Heavy oak, banded with iron, standing slightly open. She pushed it. The Duke's study was not what she expected. It was alive. Books lined every wall from floor to a ceiling that was higher than it had any right to be, and they were not decorative. These were working books. Spines cracked, pages marked with strips of leather and torn paper, stacked on the desk and the floor, and every horizontal surface in arrangements that suggested a mind that consumed information the way a furnace consumes fuel. Maps were pinned to one wall, overlapping, annotated in a hand so precise it could have been mechanical. Candles burned on iron stands placed at exact intervals, and the light they threw was steady and warm and made the room feel like the inside of a living thing. Lucien Ravencroft stood behind his desk. I was tall. That registered first because the reports had described a man diminished, wasting, reduced. There was nothing reduced about the figure in front of her. He was broad across the shoulders and lean everywhere else, and he held himself with the particular stillness of someone who had trained his body to obey his mind absolutely, even when that body was trying to betray him. His hair was dark, cut shorter than fashion dictated, and his jaw was the kind of angular that photographers would have fought over in another century. But his skin, that was where the story was written. Silver lines traced beneath the surface of his face and neck like veins made of mercury. They caught the candlelight and threw it back in faint, shifting patterns that made his features seem to move even when he was perfectly still. The lines disappeared beneath his collar, and she knew from the medical files that they continued across his chest, his back, his arms, spreading outward from his sternum like a map of a disease that had decided to make itself beautiful before it killed him. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of overcast skies, the gray of blade steel, and they were already fixed on her with an intensity that made her understand instantly why his servants were afraid. Eveline Hartwell. His voice was low, controlled, every syllable placed with the precision of a man who understood that words were weapons and had no intention of wasting ammunition. Sent by Lord Voss, medical liaison, educated at Ashford Collegium, graduated with distinction but without patronage, which means you were brilliant enough to earn attention but not connected enough to keep it. Spent 2 years in Lord Voss's household in an undefined role that the polite would call advisory and the honest would call something else. Now you are here. He had not asked her to sit. She did not move. I am here, she said. Why? You requested a liaison through official channels. Lord Voss recommended me for the position. That is what happened. I asked you why. The distinction landed like a slap, not between the facts and the motive, between what she was willing to say and what he already knew. Lord Voss believed my medical background would be useful to your household. Lord Voss believed you would be useful to Lord Voss. Lucien came around the desk. He moved slowly, and she could see now that the slowness was not weakness. It was economy. Every step cost him something, and he had decided exactly how much he was willing to spend. He stopped 4 feet from her, close enough that she could see the silver lines pulsing faintly beneath his skin, synchronized with his heartbeat. Let me save us both the performance, Miss Hartwell. I know what you are. I know what he is. I know that every name he has sent through my doors in the last 18 months has been a pair of eyes attached to a mouth that reports back to a network of men who are waiting for me to die so they can carve this estate apart like a carcass. What I do not know yet is whether you are smart enough to be dangerous or just desperate enough to be predictable. She held his gaze. The silver lines along his jaw pulsed twice, 3 times. He was measuring her. Not her words, not her posture. Something deeper. Something she could feel being tested in a place she had not known was exposed. Those are not the only 2 options, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Smiles require warmth, and there was nothing warm in this man. But the steel in his eyes developed a flaw, a fracture. The kind of imperfection that makes a blade more interesting, not less. No, he said. They are not. He turned back to his desk, opened a drawer and produced a file thick enough to suggest he had been reading about her for longer than she had been traveling to his castle. Dr. Vane will brief you on my condition this afternoon. He will use words designed to make you feel included while telling you nothing of substance. You will nod and take notes, and he will believe he has contained you. After that, you and I will have a different conversation. He sat. The chair received him without sound, and his hands, long-fingered and marked with silver lines that webbed across his knuckles like frost on glass, folded on the desk in front of him. You may go. Your Grace. Do not call me that. Grace implies something given by a power above. Everything I have, I took. He opened the file. You may call me Lucien, or you may call me nothing at all. Either is accurate. She left the tower with her pulse beating in her throat and her hands shaking at her sides, and the absolute crystalline certainty that Aldrich Voss had made a catastrophic miscalculation. This man was not dying. This man was waiting. Dr. Erasmus Vane had an office that smelled of camphor and ambition. Glass-fronted cabinets lined the walls, filled with bottles labeled in Latin and arranged with the kind of obsessive precision that suggested their owner cared more about the appearance of competence than competence itself. The desk was immaculate. The chair behind it was upholstered in burgundy leather, and Vane sat in it the way small men sit in large chairs, with his spine very straight and his chin slightly elevated, manufacturing authority from furniture. I was 40, maybe 45, with a face that had been assembled from pleasant individual features that somehow combined into something forgettable. Brown hair, brown eyes, neat hands, a mouth that naturally curved upward at the corners so he always looked mildly pleased, even when the conversation did not warrant it. Miss Hartwell, welcome to Thornmere. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He smiled. The smile had been practiced so many times it had worn smooth, like a river stone. I understand you studied at Ashford. Excellent institution. I lectured there briefly in my early career, the pathology department, if I recall. I was not in pathology. No, of course not. Your records indicate a focus on diagnostic medicine. Unusual for a woman, even at Ashford, but these are progressive times. He opened a folder. The pages inside were organized with colored tabs, and he turned them with the careful deliberation of a man who wanted her to understand how much information he controlled. The Duke's condition is complex. I will give you the summary appropriate to your role, and we can discuss the details as they become relevant. I would prefer the full picture. I am sure you would. The full picture, however, is a medical matter that falls within the scope of the attending physician's judgment. Your role, as I understand it, is coordination. Scheduling. Ensuring the Duke's daily regimen is maintained and reporting any observable changes to my office. He turned another page. The condition itself presents as a progressive systemic disorder affecting the vasculature and dermal layers. The silver scarring you may have noticed is a visible symptom. There are internal complications as well, organ involvement, cyclical fever patterns, periods of acute pain that can be debilitating. What is the diagnosis? The diagnosis is ongoing. After 2 years. The pleasant smile did not waver, but something behind it tightened, the way a rope tightens before it snaps or holds. Medicine is not arithmetic, Miss Hartwell. Some conditions do not resolve into clean categories. We manage. We mitigate. We observe. The Duke is receiving the best care available under the circumstances, and his comfort and stability are my primary concerns. Has his condition improved at all during your treatment? Define improved. Has any measurable symptom reduced in severity since you began treating him? Vane closed the folder, his fingers pressed flat against the cover. The pleasant expression remained, but she could see the machinery working behind it now. The calculations, the assessments, the rapid sorting of this conversation into categories of threat and nuisance. The Duke's condition is stable, he said. In a disease of this nature, stability is a victory. I will arrange for you to receive weekly summaries, and we will meet every Monday to discuss any observations you have made. My nurse, Sister Calloway, will be your primary point of contact for day-to-day matters. He stood. The audience was over. I am glad to have you here, Miss Hartwell. Fresh eyes are always valuable, as long as they know where to look. She left his office knowing 2 things with absolute certainty. Dr. Erasmus Vane was not trying to cure Lucien Ravencroft, and he was terrified that someone would find out why. The castle breathed at night. Eveline lay in her narrow bed and listened to it, The stone walls expanded and contracted with temperature changes so subtle they were inaudible during the day. But in the silence after midnight, they produced a low, rhythmic groaning that sounded like the building itself was in pain. Wind found its way through gaps in the masonry that centuries of repair had failed to seal, and it moved through the corridors with a sound that was not quite a whistle and not quite a moan, but something in between. Something that lived in the frequency where the human ear begins to confuse sound with feeling. She could not sleep. She had been at Thornmere for 3 days. In that time, she had memorized the layout of every accessible corridor, cataloged the behavior patterns of 12 servants, identified the 3 locked doors she was not supposed to know about, and written 11 pages of observations in her journal that she kept beneath a loose floorboard under her bed because she trusted the lock on her door about as much as she trusted Dr. Vane's diagnosis. Lucien had not summoned her again. She saw him once, crossing the courtyard at dusk with his collar turned up and his hands clasped behind his back. And even at a distance, the silver lines on his skin caught the failing light like threads of mercury woven into flesh. He moved alone. No attendants. No guards. A man walking through his own domain the way a predator walks through territory it is marked so thoroughly that the concept of threat has become theoretical. She watched him from her window until he disappeared into the North Tower, and she noticed something that did not match the medical reports. He was not moving like a man in pain. He was moving like a man conserving energy. The difference was subtle but critical. Pain makes the body contract. It rounds the shoulders, shortens the stride, pulls the chin down toward the chest as though the skeleton is trying to collapse inward and protect the organs from whatever is attacking them. Lucien's posture was upright, deliberate. He walked with measured steps, not because movement hurt, but because he was rationing something. Strength, stamina, some finite resource that he managed with the same precision he applied to everything else. She wrote it down, drew a line under it, circled the line twice. On the 4th night, she went walking. The corridors of Thornmere after dark were a different country. The candles in the wall sconces were reduced to every 3rd fixture, and the light they threw was thin and orange and made the shadows between them deep enough to hide anything. The stone floor was cold through her boots, and the air tasted of moisture and old iron and something faintly sweet that she could not identify, but that grew stronger as she moved east toward the physician's wing. She was not supposed to be here. Mrs. Blackwood's instructions had been explicit, but Eveline had spent 2 years in Aldrich Voss's household, learning that the most important information is always stored in the places you are told not to go, and she had not survived this long by following instructions designed to keep her blind. The physician's wing was quiet. Vane's office was locked, as expected, but the storeroom beside it was not. She slipped inside and stood in the darkness until her eyes adjusted, and then she began to read labels. The medications on the shelves were standard. Tinctures for pain, sedatives, anti-inflammatories derived from willow bark and concentrated into glass vials that caught the light from the corridor like tiny amber jewels. But on the lowest shelf, behind a row of unmarked bottles, she found something that stopped her. A logbook. Leather-bound, unmarked, filled with handwriting she did not recognize. Not Vane's careful, upright script. This was written fast, the letters slanting hard to the right, as though the hand that made them was trying to outrun the thoughts that produced them. She opened it to the most recent entry. Dosage increased per protocol. Suppression holding. Marked regression in dermal manifestation following administration, but systemic indicators suggest underlying process remains active. Subject unaware of modification. V. Insists current approach maintained regardless of counter indicators. Revenue stream dependent on sustained treatment timeline. She read it again. A 3rd time. The words did not change, but their meaning deepened with each pass until she could feel the shape of something monstrous assembling itself behind them. Suppression holding. They were not treating Lucien's disease. They were suppressing his recovery. Her hands were shaking. She put the logbook back exactly where she found it, aligned the bottles in front of it to match their original positions, and left the storeroom with the taste of metal in her mouth and a heart rate so elevated she could hear it in her ears. She made it halfway back to her room before a voice came out of the darkness behind her. You walk quietly for a woman who was not supposed to leave her quarters. She stopped, turned. Lucien Ravencroft stood in the corridor 20 feet away. He wore black, and in the thin candlelight only the silver lines on his face and hands were clearly visible, floating in the shadows like a constellation mapped onto human skin. His eyes caught the light and held it the way predators' eyes hold light, reflective, evaluating, utterly still. "I could not sleep," she said. "Neither could I. But I am in my own castle. You are in someone else's." He stepped closer. One step. The silver lines along his jaw pulsed with his heartbeat, steady and slow, a rhythm that did not match the tension in his shoulders. "What were you looking for?" It was not a question, it was an opening, a door left unlocked by a man who knew exactly who would try to walk through it. Eveline stood in the cold corridor with the secret burning in her chest, and the most dangerous man she had ever met standing between her and the only exit, and she made a decision that would determine whether she survived the next 30 seconds or the next 30 years. "Proof," she said. "Of what?" "That you already know what they are doing to you." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the candle wax dripping onto the iron sconces. Lucien did not move. The silver lines on his skin pulsed once, twice, and then went still, as though even his blood had paused to listen. Then he did something she did not expect. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had been playing chess against an opponent. He despised and had just watched a new piece appear on the board, one that moved in ways the original rules did not account for. "Come with me," he said. He turned and walked toward the North Tower without waiting to see if she would follow. His stride was longer now, faster, as though the conservation of energy she had observed earlier had been a performance, or as though whatever she had just said had released something inside him that no longer needed to be contained. She followed. The tower study was different at night. The candles burned lower, and the books on the walls threw shadows that made the room feel like the inside of a mind that never stopped working. Lucien closed the door behind them and crossed to his desk, where he opened a drawer she had not seen him open before, a hidden compartment built into the desk's understructure, and he pulled out a stack of papers bound with twine. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He dropped the papers on the desk between them. They landed with a weight that exceeded their physical mass, and when she looked at the top page, she saw handwriting she recognized. Fast, slanting, the same hand that wrote the logbook in the storeroom. "I found those 7 months ago," Lucien said. He sat across from her. In the low light, the silver lines on his skin looked like cracks in porcelain, like something underneath was trying to get out. "Hidden in the false bottom of a medical supply crate that was supposed to contain my medication. The nurse who wrote them, a woman named Petra Calloway, was keeping a second set of records, dosages, timelines, observations that contradicted everything Vane was reporting to me." "Sister Calloway," Eveline said. "She is still here. Vane mentioned her." "She is still here because I need her to be. The moment she disappears, Vane knows I know, and the moment Vane knows I know, the people behind him will move faster than I can counter. I have been playing dead for 7 months, Miss Hartwell, letting them increase dosages, letting them believe the suppression is working, because the alternative is tipping my hand before I know the full scope of who wants me in the ground. The dosages. You have been taking them. I have been taking some of them, the ones I can metabolize without permanent damage. The rest go into a drain in my bathroom floor." The smile again, cold, precise. "I am not a passive man, Miss Hartwell. I never have been, but I am a patient one when the kill requires it." She looked at the papers, then at him. The silver lines along his collarbones pulsed with a rhythm that was subtly different from what she had seen in the corridor. Faster, stronger, as though the conversation itself was feeding something inside him that had been starving. "You're getting better," she said quietly. "Slowly. Beneath the suppression, my body is fighting. I can feel it. Some mornings the pain is less, some nights the silver recedes from my hands, almost to the wrists, before the next dose pushes it back. Whatever this disease is, it is not a death sentence. It is a process. And someone has been sabotaging that process since before Vane ever set foot in this castle." "Who?" "That is what I need you to find out." He leaned forward. The candlelight caught his eyes and turned them from steel to something molten. "Aldrich Voss sent you here to watch me die. I am going to give you a different assignment. You are going to help me find out who is killing me, and when I have that answer, you are going to help me make them wish they had succeeded. And if I refuse, if I do what Aldrich sent me to do and report everything you have just told me, then you will confirm what I already suspect about you, and I will respond accordingly." No threat in his voice, no anger. Just the absolute terrifying calm of a man who had already considered every possible outcome and decided which ones he was willing to accept. But you will not refuse. You sound certain. I am, because you came here tonight. You went to that storeroom alone, in the dark, without protection, without allies, without a single reason to take that risk except that you needed to know. Not for Voss, not for money, not for survival. He held her gaze, and the silver lines on his face were so bright now they seemed to burn from inside, illuminating the bones beneath his skin. You needed to know because not knowing was worse than any danger the knowing could bring. I understand that impulse, Miss Hartwell. I have built my entire life on it. She sat in the Duke's tower with stolen knowledge and a choice that felt less like a decision than a detonation, the moment where the fuse meets the charge and everything after becomes irreversible. What happens if they find out you know, she said. Then whoever is behind this will stop trying to kill me slowly and start trying to kill me quickly, and we will learn very fast who our real enemies are. You say that like it is an advantage. Clarity always is, she breathed. The air in the tower tasted of candle smoke and old paper and something metallic that she realized, with a start, was coming from him, from the silver in his skin. It had a scent, faint, clean, like ozone before a storm. I have conditions, she said. Name them. Full access to every medical record in this castle, including whatever Vane keeps locked in his office, including Sister Calloway's complete notes, not just what you found in the crate. And I answer to you, not to Vane, not to Mrs. Blackwood. If I'm going to do this, I need to move through this castle without anyone having the authority to stop me except you. Lucien studied her. The silence stretched long enough to become a test, and she let it. She did not fidget. She did not qualify. She sat in the chair across from a man who could destroy her with a single word to the right people, and she waited. You left something out, he said. Did I? Protection. You did not ask for protection. Either you are foolish enough to believe you do not need it, or you are smart enough to know that I have already decided to provide it. He stood. The movement was fluid, and for one instant the silver lines across his skin flared with light so bright they cast shadows on the walls, and then they dimmed again, as though whatever lived beneath them had shown its teeth and decided to wait. You will have everything you asked for, and you will have something you did not ask for. My trust. It is a limited resource, Miss Hartwell. I have not offered it to another human being in 6 years. Do not make me regret the expenditure. He opened the door. The corridor beyond was dark and cold, and full of the sounds a castle makes when it believes no one is listening. One more thing, Eveline said from the doorway. He waited. The silver. In the logbook way, described it as a symptom of the disease. But it is not, is it? The suppression targets it specifically. Separate from the pain management, separate from the anti-inflammatories. Whatever Vane is trying to stop, it is not the illness. It is the silver itself. Lucien stood in his tower with the candlelight painting his scars into rivers of liquid metal and an expression on his face that she could not read, that no one alive could have read, because it belonged to a man who had just heard someone say aloud the thing he had spent 3 years being afraid to believe. Go to bed, Miss Hartwell, he said softly. Tomorrow we begin. She walked back through the dark corridors of Thornmere Castle with the sound of her own heartbeat filling her ears and the knowledge that she had just stepped off a cliff with no idea whether the fall would kill her or teach her to fly. And behind her, in the highest room of the North Tower, a man the world had written off as dead, sat down at his desk and opened a fresh page in a journal no one knew he kept, and he wrote a single line. She sees it. Below those words, in the margin, the silver beneath his skin left a faint metallic smear on the paper where his wrist rested, and it glowed in the candlelight for a long time after the ink had dried. Somewhere in the eastern wing, behind a locked door that Eveline had not yet found, Dr. Erasmus Vane sat in darkness with an open letter in his hands. The seal was broken. The handwriting belonged to someone whose name never appeared on official correspondence, someone who communicated only through intermediaries and unsigned instructions and payments that arrived in accounts that did not exist on any ledger. The letter contained 3 sentences. The new liaison is Voss's agent. Accelerate the timeline. The Duke must not survive the winter. Vane read it twice, folded it, lit a match, and watched it burn. The morning came in gray and cold, the way all mornings came at Thornmere, as though the sun had decided this particular piece of earth did not deserve its full attention. Eveline was already awake when the light changed. She had not slept more than 2 hours. Her journal lay open on the desk in front of her, and the 11 pages of observations she had written since arriving had been joined by 4 more, filled in the hours after she returned from the tower with handwriting that got smaller and tighter toward the bottom of each page, compressing itself the way thoughts compress when they are trying to outrun the implications of what they have discovered. Suppression holding. Systemic indicators suggest underlying process remains active. She kept returning to those words, kept pulling them apart and reassembling them in different orders to see if any configuration changed their meaning. None did. The phrase underlying process remains active was the load-bearing structure of the entire conspiracy. It meant the body was healing itself. It meant the silver, the thing everyone in this castle had been trained to interpret as a symptom of deterioration, was actually evidence of something else. Something the people behind Vane's operation had identified as a threat long before Lucien had understood it himself. Whatever was happening beneath his skin, it was not killing him. And someone had decided that was a problem. She closed the journal, hid it under the floorboard, and went to find breakfast with the household staff in the lower hall, where she ate gray porridge and listened to the servants talk around and through each other in the careful shorthand of people who have lived together long enough to communicate in omissions. The kitchen maid, a girl of maybe 19 with flour permanently embedded in the creases of her knuckles, said that the physician had left the castle before dawn. A riding horse, East Gate, no announcement. Eveline kept eating. No, Vane was gone. That meant either he had received a communication that required a face-to-face meeting with whoever was coordinating this from outside Thornmere's walls, or he had learned about her visit to the storeroom and was running. The first possibility was manageable. The second meant the timeline had just compressed in ways she was not yet equipped to handle. She found Lucien in the courtyard at 8:30. He was standing beside the well at the center of the yard with his back to her, looking at something she could not see on the far wall. The morning air pressed against her face like cold, wet cloth, and her breath came out in short bursts that disappeared almost before they formed. She crossed the flagstones to him and stopped at his shoulder. Vane left before dawn, she said, without preamble. I know. He did not turn. Eastgate. He told Mrs. Blackwood he was collecting a supply order from the apothecary in Devon. Do you believe that? I believe he needed a reason to leave that would not raise questions. Whether the reason is true is irrelevant. What matters is what he does while he is outside these walls. You have someone watching him. Now he turned. The morning light hit the silver lines on his face differently than candlelight did. Harder. More defined. In daylight they looked less like veins and more like fault lines in something that had been under enormous pressure for a very long time. His eyes were alert in a way that suggested he had slept exactly as much as was necessary, and not a moment more. I have had someone watching Vane for 4 months, he said. A man in Devon, former soldier, owes me a debt that can never be fully repaid, which means his loyalty is not contingent on payment. He looked at her without warmth, but also without the particular kind of coldness that is just cruelty wearing a mask. What did you find in the storeroom? She told him. All of it, the logbook, the specific phrasing, the word suppression, and what it implied about the structure of what was being done to him. She watched his face while she spoke and catalogued every micro-expression that crossed it, the slight tightening around his eyes at revenue stream dependent on sustained treatment timeline, the stillness that fell over him like weather when she described the notation about the underlying process remaining active. I was silent for a long time when she finished, long enough that a servant crossed the courtyard behind them and disappeared into the kitchen without either of them acknowledging it. Say what you are thinking, he said. I think your body has been trying to complete a biological process for 3 years and someone has been preventing it. Not to treat a disease, to create one. A sustained, visible, politically useful deterioration that keeps you weakened enough to be managed while your lands and your influence are quietly redistributed. She held his gaze. This is not medicine, Lucien. This is a siege conducted through chemistry. The name landed differently in the courtyard than it had in the tower the night before. More exposed, more real. Something in his expression acknowledged it without commenting on it. The silver, he said. I need to examine you. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture, resistance, the particular density of a man who had built impenetrability into his personality the way architects build load-bearing walls, Not for aesthetics, but because the whole structure collapses without them. No one has examined me in 8 months, he said, since the last physician I dismissed. I know. That means 8 months of observable progression without any documented baseline comparison. I cannot determine what the suppression is targeting without understanding what your body looks like when it is not being chemically restricted. She did not soften the request, did not frame it as anything other than what it was. I need access. I need 15 minutes, good light, and your cooperation. That is all. That is not all, and you know it. No, she agreed. It is also trust. And last night you told me you had decided to extend it. Another long silence. In the distance, somewhere beyond the castle walls, a crow called once and went quiet. Lucian's jaw shifted. The silver lines along it traced the movement like a map of a decision being made in real time. The tower, he said. 1 hour. The examination was clinical. She needed it to be. She was not immune to the reality of what she was looking at. A man who had held himself so tightly for so long that even lowering his collar in front of another person required a conscious act of will. But immunity was not what the situation required. Precision was. She brought her medical kit from her room and set it on the desk, and she lit every candle in the study until the light was good enough to work in. He stood in the center of the room with his coat and shirt removed and his arms at his sides and his face arranged into the neutral, absent expression of a man who has mentally evacuated the premises and left only his body to be examined. The silver covered him from his collarbones to his hip bones, front and back, spreading outward from his sternum in branching patterns that were not random. She saw that immediately. The lines followed the pathways of major blood vessels. Arterial maps. The body charting its own infrastructure in a language that no one in the existing medical literature had ever adequately described. She worked methodically, recorded the extent and intensity of the markings in her journal, noted where they pulsed and where they lay dormant, pressed 2 fingers against the skin along his left side, and felt the warmth there. Not fever warmth, but something different, generative warmth, the kind of heat that is a byproduct of work rather than a symptom of dysfunction. Does this hurt? She said, pressing a point just below his left shoulder blade where the silver was densest. No. And here, she moved her hand 3 inches lower. No. The pain cycles. When do they typically peak? 3 to 4 hours after the evening medication, which I stopped taking in full 6 weeks ago after I realized the timing pattern. What does the pain feel like when it comes? I was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not avoidance but accuracy. A man searching for the precise word. Pressure, he said finally, like something pressing outward from inside the bones. Like the skeleton itself is trying to expand. She wrote that down and underlined it 3 times. That is not a disease process, she said. That is a structural change. Your skeletal and vascular architecture is reorganizing. Whatever this is, it started from inside and has been working outward, and the pain is not deterioration, it is construction. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch her in his peripheral vision. Construction, he repeated. I cannot tell you what it is building. I do not have the equipment or the reference literature for a case like this. But I can tell you what it is not. It is not killing you. The suppression is the only thing in this castle that is actively working against your survival. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences in the tower. It had a quality she recognized from the moment after a diagnosis lands, that narrow window between comprehension and response, when the human mind is still calibrating what the information means for the life it had been planning to have. He put his shirt back on, buttoned it. His hands were steady. Everything about him was always steady, which she was beginning to understand was not stoicism. It was conservation. Every unit of visible calm he projected was a unit he was not expending on reaction. Calloway, he said. She is the key. She wrote the secondary records. She knows the full dosage history, the specific compounds, and whoever gave the instructions. If she is keeping a second set of records, she is either protecting herself or she has a reason to want evidence preserved. Either way, she knows more than Vane does. She has been with Thornmere for 6 years, before Vane arrived. Then she did not come with him, which means she was either recruited in place or she made a separate arrangement with whoever is orchestrating this, one that predates Vane's involvement. Eveline closed her journal. What do you know about who hired her? Standard household records. References from a medical institution in the capital. Impeccable background, which in my experience means either genuine or fabricated by someone with significant resources. He crossed to his desk. Sat. The silver along his forearms caught the candlelight and pulsed with a rhythm that was noticeably stronger than it had been at the start of the examination. She avoids me. Has since the beginning. Most staff find ways to be useful to me personally, earn proximity, protection. Calloway has never tried. She takes her orders from Vane and stays invisible. Invisible people in institutions like this are never actually invisible. They are specifically positioned. Eveline pulled on her coat. I need to get into Vane's office. The locked one. That will not be simple. I did not say it would be simple. I said I need to do it. She looked at him. You said last night you would give me access. I said you would have everything you asked for. I did not say I would make it easy. Something crossed his face. Not a smile, not quite. The closest approximation his particular architecture produced to the expression most people use when they are amused by someone they have underestimated. Mrs. Blackwood has a key. She has keys to every room in this castle. She will not give it to you without reason, and she is not a woman who accepts invented reasons. Then I will give her a real one. And what real reason will you give her? Eveline pulled the door open. The corridor beyond was daylit now, the morning having finally committed to existing, and the stone walls glowed faint amber in the slanted light. She stood in the doorway and looked back at him, at this man surrounded by books and maps, and the evidence of a mind that had been managing a siege from the inside for 3 years, holding everything together through sheer disciplined will, while the people paid to care for him quietly built his coffin. That I believe the physician who has been treating you is poisoning you, she said, and that if she gives me that key and helps me prove it, she will be on the right side of whatever happens next in this castle. She left before he could respond. But she heard him, just before the door swung fully closed. A sound she would not have identified 2 days ago. Low. Almost inaudible. The sound a man makes when he has been alone with something for so long that hearing another person say it aloud is almost physically painful in its relief. She found Mrs. Blackwood in the linen room on the 2nd floor, supervising the counting of inventory with the focused intensity of someone who uses precision over small things to maintain control over large ones. Eveline closed the door behind her and stood with her back against it and said, without any preliminary, I need you to tell me who Sister Calloway is and who placed her in this household. Mrs. Blackwood did not startle. She set down the sheet she was counting and turned with the deliberate calm of a woman who had been waiting for this specific conversation for longer than Eveline had been in the castle. Close the door. The door. It is closed. Then sit down. Eveline sat. I have been housekeeper at Thornmere for 19 years, Mrs. Blackwood said. She pulled a chair from the corner and sat across from Eveline, and her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that was not peace, but the physical manifestation of a decision held under enormous, sustained pressure. I watched 3 Ravencroft lords occupy this castle. I buried 2 of them. I know every stone, every passage, every person who has walked through those gates in 2 decades. Her eyes were direct, flat. The eyes of a woman who had measured every option available to her and was still not satisfied with the inventory. I know what is being done to him. The admission dropped into the room like a stone into still water. How long? Eveline said. I suspected within 3 months of Vane's arrival. Confirmed it 14 months ago when I found a communication in the physician's waste bin that was not fully burned. I keep a copy. She held Eveline's gaze. I have done nothing with it because I am one woman in a castle surrounded by people whose salaries are paid by the men who want the Duke dead, and because the Duke himself would not believe me without evidence, and because whatever is wrong with him, whatever the silver is, frightens the people around him badly enough that no one in this household would stand with me if I brought it forward. Her jaw tightened. I am not a coward, Miss Hartwell. I am a pragmatist. There is a difference. I know the difference, Eveline said quietly. And I am telling you the time for pragmatism has passed. The key to Vane's office was cold in Eveline's palm as she walked the east corridor at midday, with Mrs. Blackwood 2 steps behind her. The lock turned on the first try. The room beyond was exactly as she had seen it, immaculate, ordered, the glass cabinets standing like witnesses to their own complicity. She went straight to the desk. 3rd drawer. Locked, but the secondary key from Mrs. Blackwood's ring opened it, and inside, beneath a false bottom that was considerably less sophisticated than Vane apparently believed, she found it, The complete file, not Calloway's secondary notes. Not the logbook from the storeroom, something older. A correspondence archive stretching back 4 years, before the illness began, before Vane arrived, before any of it. Letters in the same unsigned hand from the burned letter, addressed to a coded name she did not recognize, but that Mrs. Blackwood, looking over her shoulder, identified in a voice gone completely flat with the effort of staying controlled. "That is Lord Aldrich Voss's private cipher," Mrs. Blackwood said. "I have seen it before. Once. On a letter delivered to this castle 3 years ago, 6 weeks before the Duke first showed symptoms." The room went very quiet. Eveline stood with the file in her hands and felt the floor shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the stone beneath her boots. The shape of it assembled itself in her mind with the terrible efficiency of things that, once seen, cannot be unseen. Aldrich had not sent her here to watch a dying man. He had sent her here because the man was not dying fast enough, and someone needed to be close enough to the machinery to make sure the end, when it came, looked natural. She had been the accelerant, delivered in person, by a man who had looked at her across a desk and called it an investment. She put the file under her arm, closed the drawer, stood in the physician's immaculate office and breathed through the rage until it compressed itself into something small and very hard and very cold at the center of her chest, the kind of cold that does not pass. "We need to move," she said. "Where?" "The tower, right now." Lucien read the letter standing up. He did not sit, he did not pace. He stood at his desk in the afternoon light with the file open in front of him, and he read every page in sequence, slowly, with the concentrated stillness of a man processing information that is simultaneously confirming everything he suspected and rewriting everything he thought he knew. The silver lines on his hands were fully visible above his shirt cuffs, and they were moving, not pulsing with his heartbeat, moving, tracing new patterns across his knuckles as she watched, branching and reforming like frost spreading across cold glass. He finished the last page, set it down, put both hands flat on the desk and stood there with his head slightly lowered and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and the silver in his skin burned so bright in the winter light coming through the narrow window that she had to look away for a moment. Then he raised his head. "Voss," he said. One word, no inflection, the way a surgeon says a diagnosis. "Yes." "He sent you here." "Yes." "Knowing what was in those files." "Yes." He looked at her, really looked, in a way that went past the surface assessment she had experienced every time before, past the measuring and the evaluating and the cataloging of her usefulness. This was something different. This was a man looking at the person standing in front of him and asking himself a question that had nothing to do with strategy. "Did you know?" he said. "No." She held his gaze without flinching. "I knew he was using me. I did not know for what. If I had known the full scope of it, I would not have come. I would have burned the letter and disappeared somewhere he could not reach." She paused. "That is the truth. Do with it what you want." The silence lasted exactly long enough to be a verdict. "I believe you," he said. Not warmly. Not because he wanted to. Because he had examined the evidence and reached a conclusion, and he was, above all things, a man who followed his evidence regardless of where it led. Which means you are in as much danger as I am now. More, possibly. You have the files. You are the only person who can testify to their origin. And Voss will know, the moment Vane reports back, that something has broken down in his operation. Vane left this morning. "Vane left this morning," Lucien agreed. His hands lifted from the desk. He straightened. The silver had settled, for the moment, back into its familiar branching patterns. But it was brighter than it had been yesterday, and the warmth she could sense from across the room was not fever. It was the heat of something building toward a threshold. Which means we have, at most, 2 or 3 days before this situation changes in ways we cannot predict. Then we use the time. We use the time. He closed the file. "Calloway first. Tonight. Before Vane returns, and before anyone outside this room knows what you found." He looked at her. The molten quality was back in his eyes. That specific heat that was not anger, but was related to it, the way a forge is related to a fire. And Eveline. The name was a different sound in his mouth than it had been anywhere else she had ever heard it spoken. "When this is finished," he said, "Aldrich Voss will answer to me personally. For every day of the last 3 years, for every letter in that file. and for sending you here as a piece in a game without telling you what board you were playing on. The silver lines along his jaw traced the line of his teeth beneath the skin, and for one moment she saw what this man had probably looked like before 3 years of careful destruction had been worked on him, what he would look like again when the siege was finally lifted. Fully realized, fully armed, something the word formidable could not quite contain. I want you to understand what that means, what I am capable of, before you decide to stay in this castle past tomorrow morning. She should have felt fear. The version of her that existed before Thornmere, before the storeroom and the tower and the file, probably would have. That version had been eroded by something she could not name yet, but recognized as necessary. I already decided, she said, last night in the corridor. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was not a smile and was not warmth, and was not anything she had a reliable word for, something that lived in the place where control begins to develop a fracture line. Then tonight, he said, we finish this. What neither of them knew was that Sister Calloway had not come to breakfast that morning. The kitchen maid who noticed thought nothing of it. The under-footman who saw her door standing open at 6 in the morning assumed she had gone to the physician's wing early. It was Mrs. Blackwood, returning to the linen room alone at 3 in the afternoon, who found the second logbook, not hidden, placed on the shelf outside the linen room door, carefully, in a spot where it would be found by someone who was already looking for it. The cover bore no writing, but inside the front page, in Calloway's fast, slanting hand, were 4 words. She's already told him. Below them, an address in the capital, and a single line that transformed everything that had come before it from a conspiracy into something with no ceiling and no floor. The Duke's condition is not a disease, it is a weapon, and someone else wants it for themselves. Mrs. Blackwood's hands did not shake when she brought the logbook to the tower. That was the first thing Eveline noticed. 19 years of service to Thornmere had apparently calibrated the woman's nervous system to absorb catastrophe, the way stone absorbs water, slowly, without visible evidence, until the damage appears all at once from the inside out. She set the logbook on Lucien's desk with the careful precision of someone handling an object that might detonate, and she stepped back and she folded her hands, and she waited. Lucien read it standing up. Same posture as the letters, same stillness. But something was different this time. The silver lines on his face were moving in a way that Eveline had not seen before, not the steady rhythmic pulse she had catalogued during the examination, but something more erratic, branching and retracting in patterns that tracked the movement of his eyes across the page. He read it twice, set it down, said nothing. The silence lasted long enough that Eveline crossed the room and read it herself. The 4 words on the first page, the address, and then the line that rewrote every conclusion she had spent the last 18 hours building from the ground up. The Duke's condition is not a disease, it is a weapon, and someone else wants it for themselves. She set the logbook down, looked at Lucien. He was staring at the wall above his maps with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not calculation, not the controlled fury she was beginning to recognize as his baseline response to threat, but something rawer. The look of a man whose internal architecture has just had a load-bearing wall removed and is processing, in real time, which parts of the structure are going to hold and which are going to fall. Calloway is gone, Mrs. Blackwood said. How long? Lucien said. Since before dawn, the same time Vane left. They left together, Eveline said. It was not a question. Through different gates, Mrs. Blackwood said, which means the departure was coordinated, planned. They expected the files to be found, possibly today, possibly by tomorrow morning. She paused. The logbook was left deliberately. She wanted us to find it. Or someone wanted us to find it, Lucien said. His voice had dropped half a register. Quiet in the specific way that things go quiet before they become extremely loud. Calloway has been in this castle 6 years. She knows every room, every passage, every pattern of movement in this household. If she wanted to leave without leaving evidence, she was capable of it. She left that logbook because she was told to. By who? Eveline said. He turned from the wall. The erratic movement of the silver had slowed, settling back into something almost regular, but the lines were brighter than she had ever seen them, hot white at their centers, fading to mercury at their edges. His body was responding to whatever was happening in his mind the way it always did, translating internal pressure into visible light. The address, he said. He picked up the logbook. looked at the inside cover again. Do you recognize it? Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, looked. Something moved through her expression, a recognition she clearly did not want to have. That is the private address of the Royal Commissioner of Medical Affairs, she said. Lord Harwick Stellan. He oversees all licensed physicians in the kingdom. The room went very still. Eveline felt the shape of it change around her. Not Aldrich Voss operating through proxies and ciphers and hired physicians. Something above Aldrich Voss. Something that used men like Aldrich the way a hand uses a glove, for grip, for insulation, for the ability to touch something dangerous without leaving fingerprints. Stellan, Lucien said, and the name sounded like a door closing. He licensed Vane's practice 4 years ago, Mrs. Blackwood said. Her voice was controlled, but her jaw was working slightly, the way jaws work when the teeth behind them are being held together by effort rather than ease. I checked Vane's credentials when he arrived. Standard procedure. Stellan's signature was on the certification. I had no reason to question it. No one would, Eveline said. She was already moving through the implications, following the chain backward, from effect to cause. Stellan controls medical licensure. That means he controls which physicians practice legally, which compounds are approved, which case files are accessible to review, and which are sealed under medical confidentiality. She looked at Lucien. If he is involved in this, Vane has not been operating independently. He has been operating with institutional protection, the kind that makes evidence disappear before it can be examined, which is why Calloway kept secondary records, Lucien said. She was protecting herself, building leverage against Stellan in case the arrangement went wrong. Eveline pressed her fingers against her forehead, thought. But she left the address. She left us the name. Which means either she is genuinely trying to give us a weapon against them, or she is leading us directly into a situation that Stellan has already prepared for. Lucien looked at her. Which do you think it is? I think it does not matter. Either way, Stellan is the target now. And either way, he knows we are coming. She lowered her hand. The question is whether we have anything he cannot neutralize before we get close enough to use it. The question hung in the air between them, while the castle breathed around them, and the winter light through the narrow window continued its slow fade toward afternoon. They had 3 hours before it answered itself. The rider arrived at the east gate at 2:30. Eveline watched him from Lucien's window, a man on a dark horse who moved with the efficiency of someone paid to cover distance rather than attract attention. He handed something to the gate guard and did not wait for a response. He turned his horse and left at the same pace he had arrived, and by the time Mrs. Blackwood brought the sealed letter up to the tower, Eveline had already catalogued 12 different ways the next 30 minutes could go wrong. Lucien broke the seal. Read the letter. His face did not change. That was how she knew it was bad. The silver lines went completely still, and his face went completely still, and that combined stillness had the quality of a landscape right before a storm hits. Not peaceful, but pressurized. He handed her the letter. The handwriting was different from the cipher in the files. This was deliberate, formal, the hand of someone dictating a legal document rather than a private communication. It read, "You have found what you were meant to find. The files are incomplete. The real records are held in a location you will not access without cooperation. Sister Calloway is willing to provide full testimony in exchange for safe passage out of the kingdom. You have until morning. Come alone to the address in the logbook. Bring the woman. Leave your household behind." She read it twice. The second time she felt the trap close around the words like a hand around a throat. "It's an extraction," she said. "They want us out of the castle." "Yes. Because inside these walls you have staff, you have the files we already have, you have Mrs. Blackwood, and whatever loyalty she can command. Outside, in a private address in the capital, you have nothing. I am aware." "Then you know we cannot go." He took the letter back, set it on the desk. His hands were flat on the surface again, that gesture she had come to read as him, physically grounding himself against the pull of something he had not yet decided whether to release. "If Calloway's testimony is real," he said, "it is the only thing that can connect Stellan directly to what was done in this castle. Without a witness, the files are circumstantial. Coded correspondence, secondary medical notes, none of it is direct evidence of intent. A good lawyer dissolves it in an afternoon." He looked up. "If she is genuinely willing to testify, she is the entire case. And if this letter is designed to separate you from any protection you have before they finish what Vane started." Then not going cost me the only witness I have, and going cost me everything else. He was quiet for a moment. The silver along his jaw traced its patterns. There is a third option. I know, she said. You send me. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard since arriving at Thornmere. No, he said, one word, flat as stone. I am the only one who makes sense. They asked for the woman specifically. They expect you to bring me as a hostage to your compliance. But if I go first, alone, before you, they lose the sequence they have planned for. I can talk to Calloway before Stellan's people can contain the conversation. If she is genuine, I get her testimony on paper and I get out. If she is not genuine, you are in a private building in the capital with people who are trying to kill the Duke of Thornmere and have been doing it successfully for 3 years. His voice had not risen. It was the flatness of it that communicated what the volume did not. You are not trained for that. You are a physician's liaison from Ashford with a medical kit and a journal and exactly one person in this castle who will not let anything happen to you. The last sentence landed differently from everything before it. Not as strategy, not as risk assessment, as something unguarded, something that had moved through the controlled architecture of what he said. The way underground water moves through stone, finding the cracks without intending to. She looked at him. He looked back. The silver lines on his face were fully still. Lucien, she said, do not. Someone has to go. And you cannot. Because if you leave this castle and they take you, there is no one left to fight this. The estate dissolves. The case disappears. Everything we found in the last 18 hours disappears with it. She held his gaze. I can do this. Let me do this. The fight in him was visible in exactly the way fights are visible in people who never let anything show. In the jaw, in the set of the shoulders, in the breathing that has become fractionally more deliberate than it was 30 seconds ago. He looked away first, toward the map wall. His eyes moved across it without reading it, the way eyes move when they are looking at something that is not in the room. You leave at dusk, he said finally. You take Thomas, the gate guard from the north. He is mine. Has been for 8 years. You do not go inside without him in position outside. You have 4 hours. If you are not back in 4 hours, I am coming myself, and I am not coming quietly. She nodded. And Eveline? He turned back. The silver lines on his face were moving again, slowly, tracing patterns that were different from anything she had mapped before. Deeper lines, following the curve of his cheekbones, the line of his brow, as though whatever lived inside him was paying attention in a way it had not before. When you come back, we are going to talk about what comes after this. She did not ask what he meant. She understood. And the understanding was a different kind of warmth from anything she had catalogued in his skin. She left the tower and went to prepare, and she did not look back, because if she had, she was not certain she would have had the will to leave. The address in the logbook resolved into a townhouse in the merchant district of the capital, 3 hours by fast horse from Thornmere, narrow-fronted and deep, the kind of building designed to contain more than its facade suggested. Thomas rode beside her without speaking. He was exactly what Lucien had described, a man carved from silence and long-term obligation, and his presence beside her in the cold, dark road was not comforting, but it was real, which was what the situation required. They arrived at 8:30. The front door opened before she knocked. A woman she did not recognize, young, with the flat, careful eyes of someone trained to give nothing away, gestured her inside. Thomas positioned himself at the corner of the building exactly as agreed, in sight of the front door, with 3 signals arranged between them that Eveline had no intention of needing. The inside of the townhouse was warm and well lit. The furnishings were expensive and impersonal, the home of a man who wanted to project substance without revealing preference. She was led up a staircase to a room on the 2nd floor where Sister Calloway sat in a chair by the window, with her hands in her lap, and an expression that occupied the narrow territory between relief and terror. Eveline sat across from her. The woman who had led her upstairs closed the door from the outside. They were alone. You are not what I expected, Calloway said. Her voice was lower than Eveline had imagined, steadier. Whatever terror was in her expression, it had been living there long enough to have become structural. What did you expect? Someone Voss chose. Someone manageable. Calloway's eyes moved over her with the assessment of a woman who had spent 6 years evaluating risks for a living. You went to the storeroom the 3rd night. I knew before Vane did. I left the logbook because I needed you to know the shape of it before you found the files. before you understood what the files actually meant. Tell me what they mean. In your words, all of it. Calloway looked at the window. The glass was dark. The street beyond was quiet. 4 years ago, Stellan commissioned a study into anomalous physiological mutations in noble bloodlines. There had been cases, 3 or 4 over the preceding decade, of individuals developing what the literature described as enhanced biological processes, accelerated healing, increased physical capacity, measurable changes in vascular and skeletal architecture, all of them presenting with the silver scarring. She paused. All of them dying within 3 years of onset. Not from the condition, from the treatment they were given for it. Eveline's hands were flat on her knees. She held very still. Because the treatment was designed to kill them. Because the treatment was designed to extract, Calloway said. The compounds that suppress the condition. They are not neutral suppressants. They accumulate. Over time, at the concentrations Vane was using, they would have destabilized the Duke's cardiovascular system severely enough to cause catastrophic failure. A natural-looking death from a pre-existing medical condition. And in the weeks before that failure, the biological material produced by the progression, the silver itself, the compounds in the skin, would have been at their highest concentration. She met Eveline's eyes. Stellan has a facility, not a medical facility, a research facility, operating without a license, without oversight, funded by 3 crown ministries that do not officially know they are funding it. He has been studying the silver from previous cases. He believes it can be synthesized, replicated, applied to people who did not inherit the biological capacity for it. She breathed. I wants to manufacture what the Duke is. The room was quiet enough that Eveline could hear the candle wax dripping. She sat in that silence and felt the shape of what she had just been told settle into place with the horrible precision of a key entering the exact lock it was cut for. A weapon. Calloway had written it in the logbook. Not a metaphor, a literal program. A man in a position of institutional power who had identified a naturally occurring biological phenomenon in a specific bloodline and had decided that the human being it was occurring in was less valuable than the raw material his body could provide. Calloway, she said, will you testify? In front of a court, under your name, everything you just told me. Calloway's jaw tightened. I kept those records for 4 years. Every dosage, every instruction Stellan sent through Vane, every piece of evidence I collected because I knew, eventually, that someone was going to need it. Her eyes were direct. Whatever fear lived in them had moved to one side and was waiting. I did not stay in that castle for 6 years because I enjoyed it, Miss Hartwell. I stayed because someone had to, and because I was the only one in position to build the case. She reached beneath her chair and produced a leather satchel, thick with papers. Everything is in here, the full records. Stellan's direct communications. Vane's signed orders. Chain of evidence, intact. She set it on the table between them. I will testify. Eveline reached for the satchel. The door opened. It was not the woman who had led her upstairs. The man in the doorway was tall, gray-haired, with the carefully assembled authority of someone who occupied important positions so long it had calcified into his posture. Lord Harwick Stellan looked at Eveline the way a researcher looks at a variable that has behaved unexpectedly. Interested, calculating, not threatened. Behind him, 2 men, large, patient. Miss Hartwell, Stellan said pleasantly, I apologize for the theater, but I needed to verify how much you knew before deciding how to proceed. He looked at the satchel on the table. I see Nurse Calloway has been generous. He looked at Calloway. More generous than was wise, I'm afraid. Calloway had gone white. You said, if I brought her here, you said, I said a great many things, Stellan said. Not unkindly. The kindness was the worst part. Most of them were true at the time, circumstances adjust. He looked back at Eveline. The satchel, please. Eveline's hand was on it. Her pulse was in her throat, and her hands were cold, and the 4 hours she had told Lucien she needed stretched out in front of her like a sentence she was no longer certain she could finish. No, she said. Stellan tilted his head. The pleasantness remained. You are a woman in a room without allies, Miss Hartwell. I respect the instinct, but the mathematics are fairly straightforward. Thomas is outside. Thomas was outside, Stellan said. He is currently being reasoned with by 2 of my staff. He is unhurt. He will remain so as long as this conversation stays productive. He took one step into the room. The Duke sent you here because he trusts you. That is, if you will forgive me saying so, a recent development. Lucien Ravencroft has not trusted anyone in 6 years, which means you did something in 4 days that no one has managed in half a decade. I find that remarkable. He stopped. It also tells me you are more valuable than your role suggests. Bring you back to Thornmere in exchange for the satchel, and the Duke cooperates with the remainder of the program. He is a practical man. He understands leverage. He will not cooperate with anything. He will when the alternative is watching someone he has just decided to protect suffer the consequences of his refusal. Stellan's voice remained even, clinical. The voice of a man who has modeled every human response in a situation and found the correct pressure point for each one. The Duke's condition is progressing faster than my original projections. In approximately 6 to 8 weeks, it will reach a threshold that cannot be reversed. At that point, whatever he is becoming will be complete, and what I can extract from the process will be significantly diminished. He looked at her. I do not want to kill him, Miss Hartwell. That was always a last resort, not a preference. Cooperation is far more useful than a corpse. Help me persuade him. And both of you walk out of this alive. The room was very quiet. Calloway was frozen in her chair. The two men behind Stellan were patient in the way that professional patience is patient, trained stillness that could become something else in under a second. Eveline looked at the satchel under her hand, looked at Stellan, looked at the window behind him, where the dark glass reflected the room back at her. A tableau of power arranged with the confidence of a man who had never once in his career been on the losing side of an arrangement he had personally constructed. She thought about Lucien in the tower, reading letters by candlelight, with silver burning under his skin and an expression on his face that said he had already counted every possible loss and decided to keep fighting anyway. She thought about what he had said. 4 hours. If you're not back in 4 hours. She looked at the clock on the wall. She had been in this room for 11 minutes. She picked up the satchel, held Stellan's gaze, and said, with a steadiness that she pulled from somewhere below the fear, below the cold, from whatever bedrock she had been building toward without knowing it, since the night she left Aldrich's house with a letter in her pocket and nothing left to lose. Then you had better send someone to Thornmere to collect him, because I am not going to help you. And in 3 hours and 49 minutes, he is going to arrive here himself. She let the words land, watched Stellan recalculate. And when he does, she said, you are going to discover exactly what you have been suppressing, and I do not think your facility is going to be large enough to contain it. Stellan stared at her for a long moment. The pleasantness did not disappear from his expression. But behind it, something shifted. Not fear. The thing that exists in the moment before fear, when a man of absolute institutional certainty encounters a variable. He did not model, and understands, for the first time, that his projections may have been built on a foundation that is no longer solid. He turned to the man on his left, spoke quietly, and Eveline felt the walls of the room close in by exactly the width of a decision that could not be unmade, as the key turned in the lock from the outside, and the window went dark, and the clock on the wall continued its counting, indifferent to everything, toward the moment when Lucien Ravencroft would arrive at a building that was designed to be a trap, carrying the full weight of 3 years of survival and 6 weeks of borrowed time, and a condition that everyone in this room had underestimated in the same catastrophic way, including her. He came before the 4 hours were up. Eveline heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, not voices. A sound she had no prior reference for, low and sustained, like the resonance a struck bell produces after the initial impact has faded, except this sound did not fade. It grew. It moved through the walls of the townhouse the way sound moves through water, omnidirectional, sourceless, filling the room until the glass in the window began to vibrate in its frame, and the candle flames bent simultaneously toward the door, as though the air itself was being drawn toward whatever was coming up the stairs. Stellan heard it too. She watched his face change, not dramatically. The pleasantness did not disappear, but beneath it, the calculation that drove everything he did, recalibrated visibly, the way a compass needle swings when it detects a field it was not designed to measure. The door came off its hinges without being struck. One moment it was closed and locked. The next it was on the floor, and Lucien Ravencroft was standing in the doorway, and the room contracted around him the way rooms contract around things that should not exist inside 4 walls. I was not the man who had stood behind his desk 4 days ago, conserving energy with the discipline of someone managing a finite resource. I was not the man who had lowered his shirt for examination with the controlled absence of someone who had evacuated the personal to preserve the functional. The man in the doorway was something that had been building for 3 years inside a body that was trying to complete a process, and whatever suppression Vane's compounds had maintained for those 3 years had, in the 3 hours and 49 minutes since Eveline left Thornmere, apparently decided it was done holding. The silver was not lines anymore. It was armor. It covered every exposed surface of skin, blazing white at his face and hands, fading to mercury at his collar. And it moved with him, responding to his breathing, brightening when he inhaled, dimming fractionally when he exhaled, as though the light itself had learned to keep his rhythm. His eyes were the same steel gray they had always been, but the temperature behind them had changed. The controlled fury she had catalogued as his baseline had burned through whatever vessel contained it and become something with no ceiling. The two men behind Stellan moved. Lucien hit the first one before Eveline had processed that he had crossed the room. The motion was not elegant. It was not the choreographed efficiency of a trained fighter performing technique. It was the movement of a body operating on pure mechanical priority, the shortest distance between 2 points, applied with a force that sent the man into the wall hard enough to crack the plaster and drop him in a configuration that suggested he would not be getting up to complicate the next few minutes. The second man was faster. He had something in his hand, a short blade, and he knew how to use it. He caught Lucien across the left forearm, a clean cut, and Eveline saw the blood before Lucien reacted to it, red against the silver, vivid as a signature. But where the blood should have slowed him, it did the opposite. The silver at the wound site flared so bright she had to look away, and when she looked back the cut was already less than it had been, the edges pulling toward each other with a speed that her medical training told her was impossible and her eyes told her was happening. Lucien took the knife away from the second man with one hand and put him on the floor with the other, and turned back to Stellan without pausing to check whether either man would stay down. Stellan had not moved. He stood beside Calloway's chair with his hands at his sides and his expression rearranged into something new. Not fear. He was past fear. What lived on his face now was the look of a researcher watching an experiment produce results that exceeded every projection. A man at the intersection of professional vindication and personal catastrophe, unable to decide which one to feel first. Remarkable, Stellan said. Where is she? Lucien said. Eveline stood up from the chair. Here. He looked at her. The silver dimmed fractionally across his face, a single oscillation, like a held breath released. His eyes moved over her the way hands move over a surface checking for damage, fast, thorough, without apology. Are you hurt? No. The satchel. She held it up. He looked at Stellan. Lucien. Stellan's voice was steady. That was the thing about men like him. They did not lose the steadiness. It was not courage. It was the specific composure of someone who believes they are always the most important person in any room and has not yet been given sufficient evidence to revise that belief. Look at yourself. Look at what you are capable of right now. The progression has accelerated beyond anything I projected. Do you understand what that means for your program, Lucien said, for your facility, for the 3 people who died before me when you decided their biology was more useful than their lives. He crossed the room until he stood 2 feet from Stellan and looked down at him with the silver burning across his face like a second skeleton. I understand exactly what it means. Stellan did not step back. You are going to need help managing what you are becoming. The process does not plateau. It continues, without guidance, without the right, without you. Without someone who understands what is happening to you. I am the only person who has studied this. I have years of data. I have resources you cannot access through conventional. You have a building full of evidence that will dismantle every institution you have hidden behind for the last decade, Lucien said. And you have approximately 4 minutes before the men I brought with me finish securing your staff and come up these stairs. The steadiness finally cracked. Not dramatically. A hairline fracture across the composure, visible only because Eveline had been watching his face with the same attention she gave everything in this room, cataloging, measuring, tracking the delta between what people showed and what they meant. You cannot prosecute this without implicating men in positions that, I know exactly which men, I have known for 3 years. I was waiting until I had something to survive with after I did it. Lucien looked at him. That time is now. Stellan's eyes moved to the satchel in Eveline's hands, to Calloway, still frozen in her chair, to the two men on the floor, to the door that was no longer a door. The calculation ran its final iteration behind his eyes and produced an answer that sat on his face like a verdict. You will not be able to control it, he said quietly. Not a threat. Something more disturbing. A prediction delivered with the certainty of a man reading empirical data. The silver. The process. It does not stop because you want it to. It does not moderate because you have other priorities. Every case before you went the same way. The progression accelerated, reached a peak, and then the subject died, Lucien said, because you killed them, to collect what their bodies were producing. The silver across his jaw traced the line of his teeth. That is not a projection. That is a pattern you manufactured. You do not know what happens if the process completes uninterrupted because you have never let it. The silence that followed was the kind that exists at the center of things. Not between sounds, but between one version of events and another. Then Calloway stood up. Her hands were shaking. Her voice was not. I will testify, she said. Every instruction he sent through Vane, every dosage, every communication, all of it. Stellan looked at her with an expression that was almost sorrowful. Almost. Petra. Do not, she said. Do not use my name like that. Not now. Her jaw was rigid. Whatever she had been holding back for 6 years was pressing hard against the back of her teeth. I kept those records because I knew this day was coming, because you told me the subjects did not suffer, and I watched the Duke suffer for 3 years, and I am done pretending those two things can coexist. She looked at Lucien. Her eyes were direct. I am sorry. For every day I stayed inside that role. I am sorry. Lucien looked at her for a moment. The silver was steady across his face. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of the edge that had entered it in the doorway. Not all of it. Some. Get downstairs, he said. Thomas will take you out. Calloway picked up her coat and left without looking at Stellan again. Eveline moved toward the door. Lucien did not move. He was still looking at Stellan, and the quality of that stillness had changed again, cycling through registers the way the silver cycled through its brightness, each state distinct, each one containing the memory of every state before it. Lucien, she said. One moment. Stellan looked between them. The pleasantness was gone entirely now, stripped away by the last 20 minutes, the way weather strips away topsoil, revealing the geology beneath. What was left was not malevolent. It was something more unsettling, genuinely, clinically curious. A man at the end of his own story still taking notes. The woman, Stellan said. He looked at Eveline. 4 days. He trusts you completely in 4 days. Do you know how long it took me to build the mechanism that was supposed to produce that kind of opening? 8 months. He tilted his head. You did it by accident, I assume. I did it by being honest, Eveline said. Remarkable, Stellan said again. And this time the word carried no condescension. It carried something that on a different man in a different room might have been admiration. Lucien put his hand on Stellan's shoulder. Not violently, not gently, with the specific pressure of someone establishing a physical fact. My men are going to take you somewhere you will not enjoy, he said. And tomorrow, the correspondence in that satchel is going to every judicial office in the kingdom that Voss has not already compromised, which leaves 3. He held Stellan's gaze. You're going to spend the remainder of your considerable intelligence trying to determine which 3. I suggest you use the travel time productively. He let go of Stellan's shoulder, turned, crossed the room to where Eveline stood in the doorway and looked at her in the specific way he had looked at her twice before. Not the assessment and not the calculation, but the third thing, the one that did not have a name in the vocabulary of a man who had spent 6 years deciding that everything which mattered had already been taken from him. You said 4 hours, he said. You came in 3. You were going to fight him over a satchel. I was going to hold the satchel for as long as it took you to get here. Something shifted in his expression. The fracture line that had appeared the night before in the tower opened fractionally further, and through it she could see the thing he kept behind the controlled architecture of everything else. Not the fury, and not the calculation, and not the silver burning through his skin, but the human wreckage underneath all of it. 3 years of isolation and deliberate deterioration, and the specific loneliness of a man who had been too intelligent to miss what was being done to him and too trapped to stop it. He reached up and took the satchel from her hand. His fingers closed over hers for 1 second before he pulled it away, and the silver on his skin where they touched flared white and then dimmed, and she felt the warmth of it against her knuckles like a hand pressed briefly against a lamp. "We need to move," he said. They went downstairs. The ground floor of the townhouse had been methodically, efficiently neutralized by the 4 men Lucien had brought, none of whom he had mentioned to her at any point during the planning of the evening, because Lucien Ravencroft did not share operational details with people who had not yet earned complete operational trust, and even trust had its hierarchies. Thomas was outside, alive and irritated, and with a bruise forming across his left cheekbone that he touched exactly once, and then ignored with the stoicism of a man who had sustained worse and catalogued it under acceptable costs. Calloway was with him. She had her coat pulled tight, and her jaw set, and the expression of a woman who had made an irrevocable decision and was now standing on the other side of it, assessing the new terrain. They rode back toward Thornmere through the dark. Eveline rode beside Lucien close enough that she could see the silver in his skin catching the moonlight through the bare trees, pulsing with his heartbeat in a rhythm that was faster than usual but steady. The cut on his forearm had closed entirely. She had looked at it before they mounted. The skin over it was smooth. The silver ran across it in a line that was brighter than the surrounding markings, as though the body had flagged the repair for its own record. He did not speak for the first hour. Neither did she. The road was dark and uneven, and the horses needed attention, and there was something in the silence between them that did not require filling. It was not comfortable silence. It was honest silence, the kind that exists between people who have seen each other in conditions that strip away every performance and are still choosing to ride in the same direction. At the hour mark, when the trees thinned and the road widened and Thornmere's towers became visible against the sky, dark shapes against a slightly lighter darkness, he said, "Voss will know by morning." Yes. He will move to protect himself, distance himself from Stellan, destroy whatever correspondence links him directly. We have the files. The files name the cipher, not the man. His lawyers will argue forgery, fabrication, a conspiracy against a lord of the kingdom by a dying duke with motivation to manufacture enemies. He was quiet for a moment. The silver along his jaw caught a shift in the wind and brightened. He will come here, personally, within the week, to assess the damage and determine how much can still be salvaged from whatever plan he had running through Stellan. Eveline thought about Aldrich Voss at his desk with his manicured hands and his careful voice and the expression of a man delivering a death sentence while maintaining the vocabulary of generosity. She thought about the letter in her pocket that she had read so many times the creases had worn through to holes. She thought about what he had said. An investment. In both of us. "Let him come," she said. Lucien looked at her sideways. The silver across his face was bright in the moonlight, and his eyes in it were the temperature of something that had moved past cold into the absolute stillness of deep winter water. "When he gets here," Lucien said, "he is going to find something that does not match any version of Thornmere he has been tracking. Not a dying duke, not a manageable asset, not a situation that can be renegotiated." The silver flared across his cheekbones, subsided. "And he is going to find you, standing in my castle, not as his instrument." "As what?" He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than the road required. The silver was fully active across his face now, every line bright and moving, and in it she could see the architecture of what he was becoming, the structural completion of something that had been under construction for 3 years. Not a disease and not a deterioration, but a transformation that his body had been fighting to finish, while every resource available to 3 careful men had been dedicated to preventing it. "We will determine that," he said, "when this is finished." They rode the last mile to Thornmere in silence, and the castle rose up out of the dark around them as it always did, enormous and certain and made of stone that had outlasted everything that had ever tried to bring it down. Inside its walls, in the locked east wing room that Eveline had not yet found, a candle burned on a desk beside an open ledger. The ledger contained 73 pages of names, dates, payments, and instructions connecting Lord Aldrich Voss to Lord Harwick Stellan, to 6 crown officials and a network of provincial lords who had been quietly preparing for the redistribution of Ravencroft territories for 2 years. The person who had left the candle burning was not Dr. Vane. It was not Sister Calloway. It was Mrs. Blackwood, who had been sitting in that room for 4 hours with a cup of cold tea and the patience of a woman who had spent 19 years learning that the most important conversations in a castle always happened in the rooms no one was supposed to know existed. She heard the horses in the courtyard, stood, walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame and looked back once at the ledger on the desk, at the candle burning beside it, at the 73 pages that would, by morning, rewrite the political architecture of half the kingdom. Then she blew out the candle, tucked the ledger under her arm, and went downstairs to meet them. And in the courtyard, as Lucien dismounted and reached up without thinking to steady Eveline's horse while she climbed down, and as his hand stayed on the bridle 1 second longer than the task required, and as she looked at him in the dark with the silver light of him catching in her eyes, the east gate opened. A rider appeared, alone, moving fast. He wore Aldrich Voss's colors, and he carried, held out before him like a weapon presented for inspection, a royal writ bearing the crown seal, sealed and signed, ordering the immediate arrest of Duke Lucien Ravencroft on charges of conspiracy against the state. The rider pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet from them. The animal heaved and blew steam. The courtyard was very quiet. Every servant who had been in the yard had stopped moving, frozen, in the specific stillness of people who understand that whatever they are witnessing will determine the shape of the next several years of their lives. Lucien took the writ. Read it. His face in the silver light of his own skin was absolutely still. Then he looked up at the rider. "Tell Lord Voss," he said, and his voice carried across the courtyard to every frozen servant and every dark window and the very stones of the walls around them, "that I will be in the capital within 3 days. Tell him to have his lawyers present." The silver blazed across his face, full and total and blinding for 1 second before it settled. "Tell him to have everyone present, because what I am bringing with me will not require a second meeting." The rider stared at him, at the silver, at the man who was supposed to be 3 weeks from death standing in his own courtyard with the writ in one hand, and a woman who was not supposed to be anything standing at his shoulder like she had been there for years. The rider left without responding. Lucien folded the writ, put it in his coat pocket, turned to Eveline. 3 days, he said. "I heard. Whatever Voss has prepared, it will be everything he has. He does not have a fallback position. This is the writ or it is nothing, which means he has already decided that subtlety is finished and he is going to bury this under institutional weight before the satchel reaches a court. Then we move faster than he expects." "Yes." His eyes were on her. The silver across his face was steady now, its rhythm synchronized with his breathing, and in it she could see the man who had been waiting behind 3 years of calculated survival, fully assembled, fully armed, and oriented toward a fight he had been preparing for since the first letter from Stellan arrived, and the first dose from Vane entered his bloodstream, and he had lain in the dark of his tower and understood, with the absolute clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose, exactly what was being done to him, and exactly how long it would take to be in a position to answer it. I was in that position now. "Come inside," he said. "There is a room in the east wing you have not seen yet." He walked toward the castle doors. She fell into step beside him. Their shadows crossed in the torchlight, overlapping, and above them the north tower rose against the winter sky with its narrow windows lit from inside, and the silver lines of the Duke of Thornmere burning through the dark, like a map of everything that had survived. The east wing room smelled of old candle wax, and the particular stillness of secrets kept so long they had become part of the architecture. Mrs. Blackwood had lit the lamps by the time they arrived, and their light fell across the open ledger on the desk with the matter-of-fact patience of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment and had decided, somewhere in the last 19 years, that patience was not a virtue, but a weapon, the slowest and most reliable one available to a person without institutional power. Lucien stood over the desk. He did not sit. He read the ledger the way he read everything, with absolute attention, turning each page with a steadiness that did not match the silver still burning at full brightness across his face and hands. Eveline stood beside him and read alongside him, and the numbers in the ledger assembled themselves into a portrait of a conspiracy so deliberate and so deep that it had the quality of architecture rather than crime. It had been designed, load-bearing walls, redundant systems, escape routes built into every layer, 73 pages, 61 names. 2 years of documented preparation for the moment. Lucien Ravencroft stopped breathing. When he finished the last page, he closed the ledger, set his hand flat on the cover. The silver beneath his skin pressed against his palm from inside, bright enough to show through the skin, and then it receded. Not gone. Settled. Like a tide that has reached its highest point and begun, almost imperceptibly, to pull back towards something it recognizes as its own level. Voss is on page 47, Mrs. Blackwood said from the doorway. 14 direct payments, 3 letters in the original cipher. 2 of them contain language specific enough to constitute direct instruction. She paused. I have kept copies in 3 separate locations outside this castle for the past 8 months. Lucien looked at her. Something crossed his face that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude, but occupied the territory where both of those things live before they become language. You could have used those copies at any point, he said. I could have used them at the wrong moment, she corrected. There is a difference. A document presented before its time is a document without weight. Everything needed to be in the room at once. The files, the witness, you. Her eyes moved to Eveline. And someone he would listen to who was not already part of the machinery. Eveline met her gaze, held it. The understanding that passed between them in that moment was the kind that does not require narration. 2 women in a castle built by men for the purpose of consolidating male power, who had each in their own way been handed a role designed to keep them useful and contained, and who had each in their own way found the space inside that role to build something the role had not accounted for. 3 days, Lucien said. He straightened. We leave for the capital at dawn the day after tomorrow. That gives us 1 day to prepare the documentation package and identify which judicial offices are reachable. He looked at Mrs. Blackwood. The copies you kept. I need them here by morning. They will be here within the hour, she said. I sent for them before you returned. He was quiet for a moment. How long have you been running this? Since the day I found the first incomplete letter in Vane's waste bin, she said, 14 months ago. I could not fight it from inside, so I built an outside, brick by brick, and I waited for someone to open the door from the other direction. She looked at him with the directness of a woman who has decided that the time for indirection ended approximately an hour ago. I did not tell you because you would have moved too fast. You would have gone at Stellan directly, and Voss would have used the writ the moment the castle walls stopped protecting you. He used the writ anyway. He used it too late, she said. That is the difference between 14 months ago and tonight. Lucien held her gaze for a long moment. The silver across his face was gentle now, the erratic brightness of the townhouse entirely gone, replaced by the steady rhythmic pulse she had first catalogued in the examination. His body had found its level. Whatever the confrontation had cost him physically, the cost had been absorbed and processed, and the machinery beneath his skin had continued its work without asking permission. Thank you, he said. 2 words. No qualification. The most expensive currency in the vocabulary of a man who had not offered it to another human being in 6 years. Mrs. Blackwood nodded once and left to retrieve her copies. They sat in the East Wing room for 2 hours after that, Lucien and Eveline, organizing the documentation with the methodical focus of people who understand that the most important battles are won in the preparation, not the field. The satchel from Calloway. The files from Vane's office. Mrs. Blackwood's copies. The ledger. Cross-referenced, sequenced, each piece placed in relation to every other piece until the whole formed an argument so structurally complete that dismantling any single element only strengthened the surrounding ones. It was close to 2 in the morning when Lucien set down the last document and leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in a way she had never seen him do before. Not strategic, not calculating, simply a man allowing himself one unguarded vertical moment in a day that had contained more than its share of the opposite. You should sleep, she said. So should you. I asked first. He lowered his gaze from the ceiling, looked at her across the desk with an expression that had shed several of its usual layers. The controlled neutrality, the deliberate assessment, the calibrated distance. What remained underneath was something that had been there from the beginning. She understood that now, present in the first conversation in the tower, visible in the margins of every exchange since, but never quite permitted to occupy the center of anything. I have not slept more than 3 hours at a time in 3 years, he said. The pain cycles, or what I thought were pain cycles. The suppression wears off in the night and the process tries to reassert itself, and the conflict between them is... He stopped, looked for the word. Loud, he said. Inside. The way a building sounds when its structural elements are fighting each other. That should be less now, she said. The suppression is wearing off without being replaced. Your body is going to try to complete the progression, and it is going to be uncomfortable, but it is not going to be the same conflict you have been managing. She looked at him. You will need monitoring, real monitoring, not Vane's performance of it, someone who is actually tracking the progression without trying to redirect it. Are you volunteering? I am stating a medical necessity. That is not what I asked. She held his gaze. The silver across his face was very quiet now, the pulses long and slow and deep, the rhythm of a body finally, after 3 years of forced deviation, finding its own pace. Yes, she said, I am volunteering. I was quiet for a moment. The thing that had no name in his vocabulary moved through his expression again, and this time it stayed long enough for her to understand what it was. Not gratitude, not calculation, not the carefully managed warmth of a man deciding how much emotional territory is strategically safe to cede. It was simpler than all of those and more dangerous than any of them. It was the look of someone who has been alone with something unbearable for so long that the presence of another person who has decided to stay is a fact his system does not entirely know how to process. Then stay, he said. 2 words. The mirror of the 2 he had given Mrs. Blackwood. The same currency. A different denomination. She stayed. The capital received them 3 days later like a city that had already been told a story and was waiting to find out how much of it was true. Lucien rode at the front of a column of 12, which was not an army but was not nothing, and the silver was visible on his face and hands in the winter daylight in a way that had no precedent in the kingdom's public record, because none of the previous cases had survived long enough to appear in public with the progression at this stage. People on the street stopped, not from recognition, from the silver itself, from the quality of presence it gave him, as though the man on the horse was slightly more substantial than the air around him, slightly more real than the buildings behind him. Eveline rode at his right hand. She had not discussed this positioning with him. She had simply mounted and moved to that position, and he had looked at her once and moved nothing, and that had been the conversation. The judicial office of Minister Carlo was the first. Carlo was 60, methodical, with the institutional caution of a man who had survived 4 administrations by being more useful than he was threatening. He read the documentation package in 40 minutes of complete silence, while Lucien sat across from him and Eveline stood at the window, and the silver lines on Lucien's face pulsed with the patience of someone who had been waiting for this specific meeting for 3 years and was not about to compromise it with impatience now. When Carlo finished, he closed the package and placed both hands flat on his desk and stared at the wall behind Lucien for a long moment. This is complete, Carlo said. Yes, Lucien said. The Voss cipher, Stellan's direct communications, the dosage records, the payment ledger, Calloway's testimony. He touched the cover of the package without opening it again. If this is authenticated, and I have no immediate reason to doubt that it is, this constitutes the most comprehensive case for systematic criminal conspiracy against a noble house that this office has processed in my tenure. Then process it, Lucien said. The men named in the ledger include 2 sitting ministers and a crown advisor. I am aware. The political implications are the judiciary's problem, Lucien said. His voice was level, not aggressive, simply stating the boundary between his responsibility and someone else's. My problem was surviving long enough to put that package on your desk. I have done that. What happens to it now is your domain, Minister. I trust you understand the weight of what I am leaving in your hands. Carlo looked at him, at the silver, at the woman standing at the window with a medical satchel and the bearing of someone who had already decided that whatever happened in this room, she was not leaving without the right answer. I will issue the preservation order today, Carlo said. Voss will be restricted from leaving the capital by nightfall. Stellan's facility will be secured tomorrow morning. He paused. This will take months to fully prosecute. The institutional complexity alone. Take whatever time you need, Lucien said. It has already taken 3 years. A few more months will not change the outcome. He stood. Carlo stood. They did not shake hands. The gesture would have been insufficient for what had just occurred in that room, and both men understood that, and neither performed it. Aldrich Voss received them in his private study that afternoon. He had not been told they were coming. His manservant had tried to redirect them at the door and had been moved gently but completely out of the way by Thomas, who was developing bruises from the previous night's activities into a color palette that suggested commitment to the work. Voss was standing when they entered. He had been standing at his window, which meant he had seen them in the street below, which meant he had had approximately 90 seconds to prepare himself. And what 90 seconds had produced was the expression of a man who had decided that the best available position was calm, because everything else had already been taken. He looked at Lucien, at the silver. His jaw shifted fractionally. "You look well," he said. "I am," Lucien said, "considerably better than your physicians projected." Voss's eyes moved to Eveline. Something passed through them that she recognized. Not regret. Men like Aldrich Voss did not experience regret in the way the word is normally meant. They experienced the specific discomfort of a strategy that has inverted, of a piece moved to produce one outcome that has instead produced the opposite. He looked at her the way a chess player looks at a queen he sacrificed and watches return from the other side of the board. "Eveline," he said. "Lord Voss," she said. The formality landed exactly as she intended it, not as cruelty, as a boundary drawn in permanent ink. The 2 years in his household, the promises, the letter across the desk, the careful vocabulary of investment and opportunity that had been the architecture of his control over her, all of it reduced by that single formal address to what it had always been. A professional arrangement that one party had exited with considerably more than he had given her and considerably less than he had taken. "The documentation is with Minister Carlo," Lucien said. He did not move further into the room. He stood in the doorway and spoke from there, which communicated exactly what he intended it to. He was not a guest. He was not a supplicant. He was a man who had decided that whatever square footage Aldrich Voss occupied was not worth more of his presence than this. "The preservation order covers your accounts and correspondence. Your lawyers will advise you on what that means for the next several months." Voss looked at him for a moment. The calm he had assembled in 90 seconds held, but showed its construction. "You cannot prosecute this without implicating men who will fight it with resources that—" "I know which men will fight it," Lucien said. "I have known since page 47 of a ledger you did not know existed. I spent 3 years being careful, Aldrich. I was careful because I could not afford to be wrong. I am not wrong." He tilted his head slightly. The silver along his jaw caught the afternoon light through Voss's window and returned it without warmth. "You sent her here to watch me die. I want you to understand clearly that I am grateful. Because without that specific miscalculation, I would still be sitting in Thornmere waiting to accumulate evidence, and everything in Carlo's office right now would still be in pieces." Voss said nothing. His jaw worked once. His hands, those long manicured hands that Eveline had once found beautiful, were very still at his sides. "We are finished," Lucien said. Not as punctuation, as a formal declaration of a state that was now permanent and would not be revisited. He turned to leave. "She will leave you," Voss said. His voice was quiet, almost without inflection. The last resource available to a man who has run out of every other kind. When the silver stabilizes, when you are whole again, and the extraordinary circumstances that produced this, he gestured, a small helpless motion at the space between them, have passed, she will leave. Women like Eveline do not stay in places built for containment. Lucien stopped, did not turn immediately. When he did, the silver across his face was fully lit, every line at its peak brightness, but his expression was the calmest she had seen it since the courtyard, the calmest she suspected it had been since before the illness began. "You are right," he said. "She will not stay in a place built for containment." The silver dimmed slightly, steadied, which is why Thornmere is going to stop being one. He left. Eveline looked at Aldrich Voss for one moment, at the careful face and the careful hands and the careful study built around the performance of substance. She thought about the letter she had memorized. She thought about the drive to Thornmere in the gray light with the driver who looked at her like livestock. She thought about who she had been when she folded that letter and put it in her pocket, and the distance between that person and the one standing in this doorway now. The distance was not Lucien. She understood that clearly. The way you understand things, you have worked out alone in a narrow bed in a strange room in the middle of the night. The distance was the consequence of her own decisions. Every choice she had made since arriving at Thornmere had been hers. The storeroom, the corridor, the tower, the capital. She had not been rescued. She had moved, deliberately, toward the thing that frightened her most, which was not Lucien Ravencroft and not Stellan and not the silver burning through a man's skin. It was the person she was capable of being when no one was managing her potential for their own benefit. She looked at Aldrich Voss. She said nothing, and she left. The months that followed moved the way months move when they contain actual events instead of waiting. Stellan's facility was secured and its contents cataloged by 3 separate judicial teams who produced reports that aged the political landscape of the kingdom by approximately a decade in the space of 6 weeks. The prosecutions moved slowly, as Carlo had warned, through layers of institutional complexity that had been deliberately constructed to slow exactly this kind of accountability. But they moved. That was the thing that could not be reversed. Once the ledger was in Carlo's hands, the direction of travel was set, and the men named in its 73 pages discovered, one by one, that the resources they had spent years accumulating in anticipation of Thornmere's dissolution were now deployed in a different direction than they had projected. Calloway testified in the 4th month. She sat in a judicial chamber with her hands folded and her voice steady, and she gave 11 hours of testimony across 3 days that was so precisely documented and so structurally coherent that the opposing lawyers spent more time contesting each other than contesting her account. She was given safe passage out of the kingdom as promised. Before she left, she came to Thornmere. Lucien received her in the courtyard, not the tower. The courtyard, in daylight, with the castle around them, and the winter finally releasing its grip on the stone walls, and something that was tentatively, experimentally, resembling spring showing in the crooked trees along the road. "You could have come forward earlier," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a question that contained an entire other conversation inside it. "I know," she said. "I was afraid. And then I was ashamed of being afraid. And then I understood that the shame was less useful than whatever I could do with the time I had left inside the arrangement." She looked at him, at the silver which had settled in the weeks since the capital into something quieter than it had been. The lines, present but subdued, present the way scar tissue is present, as a record of a process completed rather than evidence of one still ongoing. "Is it finished, the progression?" "Nearly," he said. "Eveline believes another few weeks." "Does it hurt?" "Less every day." Calloway nodded. She looked at the castle, at the walls and the towers and the crooked trees. She looked at all of it with the expression of a woman cataloging a place she will not see again and wants to remember accurately rather than kindly. "I am sorry," she said, "for the years I spent being useful to the wrong people." "You were useful to me," he said. "At the end, that counts." She left that afternoon. He watched her carriage until it disappeared down the road, and Eveline watched him watch it, and neither of them spoke until it was gone. "She made the only choice available to someone in her position," Eveline said. "I know." He turned from the road. "The same choice available to everyone in this castle for 3 years. To do nothing and survive, or to do something and risk not surviving." He looked at her. The silver across his face shifted in the spring light, and for the first time she saw it not as a symptom or a transformation or a weapon or a mystery, but simply as part of his face. Something that had always been there, working toward its own completion, requiring nothing from her except that she not try to stop it. "You made a different choice. I did not have much to lose. You had your life. I had my survival," she said. "That is not the same thing." He looked at her for a long moment. The spring light was behind her, and it put her in silhouette against the pale sky, and he looked at the shape of her the way he had looked at the ledger and the maps and everything else in his life that required his full attention, completely, without reservation, without the management of distance. "No," he said, "it is not." The ceremony was small. Thornmere had never been a castle for ceremonies, for the elaborate performances of power that other noble houses used to communicate their importance to audiences who needed the reminder. What it was, under Mrs. Blackwood's 19 years of careful management and Lucien's particular philosophy of substance over spectacle, was a castle for people who understood that the most durable things are built quietly, without announcement, from materials that do not require constant attention to maintain their integrity. Eveline became Duchess of Thornmere on a morning in late spring when the crooked trees along the road had finally produced their leaves and the stone walls of the castle had dried for the first time since autumn. Mrs. Blackwood cried once, briefly, in the corridor outside the study, and then composed herself with the efficiency of a woman who had decided that 19 years of waiting for this place to stop being defined by loss entitled her to exactly that many seconds of emotional expression before returning to the work. Thomas, standing guard at the main door with a posture suggesting he found the entire event mildly excessive, moved his hand once toward the bruise on his cheekbone that had long since faded, a phantom gesture, and then lowered it. Lucien stood in the courtyard afterward with Eveline at his side, and the silver quiet beneath his skin, and the spring air moving through the castle from east to west, finding the gaps in the stone that 300 years of repair had not sealed. And he thought about what it meant to have survived a thing you were not supposed to survive. Not the conclusions, not the political restructuring or the legal proceedings still moving through the capital's slow machinery, or the practical reality of two people building something out of the wreckage of what 3 years of systematic destruction had left behind. He thought about the fact of it. The bare, unremarkable fact that he was standing in his own courtyard in spring sunlight, and he was not in pain, and the woman beside him had chosen to be beside him with full knowledge of every cost the position carried. He had spent 3 years learning that survival was a skill, that it required discipline and patience and the particular ruthlessness of someone willing to sacrifice comfort and connection and the ordinary pleasures of an unguarded life in order to remain in the game long enough to change its terms. He had been right about that. He was not wrong about it now, but he understood something he had not understood. In the tower alone, with his books and his maps and his carefully managed fury, survival is the prerequisite, not the achievement. The achievement is what you build once you have decided to stop spending every resource on staying alive and start spending some of it on what alive means. He looked at Eveline. She was looking at the road, at the spring light on the crooked trees, and her expression was the one he had learned to read not as absence, but as depth. The face she wore when she was thinking something she had not yet decided to say. "What?" he said. "Nothing." "That is not your nothing face, that is your something face." She turned. The corner of her mouth moved. "I was thinking about the first morning, when Mrs. Blackwood told me not to wander after dark because a maid broke her neck on the east staircase. And I wandered anyway." "You did," he agreed. "I was thinking that was probably the most consequential bad decision I have ever made." He looked at her. The silver across his face was very quiet, the lines faint in the spring light, present without announcing themselves. The fracture line that had appeared in his expression the first night in the tower had not closed. He had stopped trying to close it. It had become the place where something could move through when it needed to. Air through old stone, light through imperfect glass, the ordinary transmission of one person's interior to another's. "It was not a bad decision," he said. "No," she said. "It turned out not to be." She looked back at the road, at the trees, at the crooked, persistent, light-collecting leaves that had no business existing on branches that had been split open by years of bad weather and had grown back anyway. It turned out to be the only decision that mattered. He reached across and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with the studied deliberateness of a man performing a gesture he has calculated for effect. Simply took it. The way you take something you have decided belongs within your reach and have stopped pretending otherwise. The spring air moved through the courtyard. The silver in his skin caught the light once, briefly, and returned it. Thornmere Castle, which had been a place of death, and then a siege, and then a battlefield, and then the architecture of a conspiracy, and then the evidence of its own survival, stood in the late morning with its gates open and its walls drying in the warmth. And it was not transformed. It was not redeemed. It was not the same place it had been the autumn Eveline arrived in a carriage driven by a man who looked at her like livestock. It was simply the place where two people who had each, in their own way, been asked to perform their own diminishment, had looked at the script and decided to burn it. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.